She recognized him instantly. Who wouldn't? He had been on screens larger than life, his face etched into the collective memory of millions. But here, now, under the warm boutique lighting, he was just another customer. And that, in itself, was unusual. "Good evening, sir," she said with a practiced smile. "How can I assist you today?" Before he could answer, the moment shattered. The boutique door slammed open so hard it rattled the walls. A man stormed in, his face twisted in fury, his movements sharp and desperate. A beat of silence, then a piercing voice ripped through the air. "Give me the diamonds. Now." The words cut through the boutique like a blade, sending a ripple of tension through the room. A gun glinted in his hand. The air turned thick, suffocating. Every muscle in her body locked, her breath stuck in her throat. No one moved. No one except him. The gunman's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening as he swept his weapon across the boutique, eyes darting between the saleswoman, the lone security guard, and the other customers frozen in place. The air had changed, thick with an unspoken fear that clamped around their throats, pressing them into silence. He took a step forward, his voice sharp, edged with something desperate, something reckless, the kind of tone that suggested he was moments away from losing what little control he had left. "I said give me the diamonds. Don't make me repeat myself." His gaze locked onto the saleswoman behind the counter, the weight of his anger pressing down on her like a physical force. She didn't move, not because she didn't understand the threat, but because her body refused to obey. Her mind screamed at her to comply, to do anything that would make this man leave, but she was caught in the kind of terror that paralyzed rather than propelled. The security guard, positioned near the entrance, inched his hand toward his holster, but the gunman's attention snapped to him in an instant, and before anyone could process the movement, the sharp, metallic click of the safety being switched off shattered the silence. The warning was clear. Another step, another wrong move, and this situation would turn from a robbery into something much worse. The guard froze. The boutique was drowning in stillness. Every person in the room held their breath, every pair of eyes trained on the weapon, every muscle stiff with the kind of tension that turned seconds into eternity. The only person who moved was the man standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable, his presence steady, unfazed, as though he had already calculated every possible outcome in his head. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, drawing the attention of the gunman, shifting the pressure away from the woman behind the counter and onto himself. "Put the gun down," he said, his voice calm, even, with the kind of certainty that wasn't a request but a command. There was no fear in his tone, no hesitation, no trace of the nervous energy that filled the boutique like a suffocating fog. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't bargaining. He was simply stating a fact, as if the situation had already been resolved in his mind and the gunman had no choice but to comply. The shift was immediate. The gunman hesitated for the first time, his grip twitching, his stance faltering. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were spoken, the way they carried a weight that cut through the tension like a knife. The people around them, the terrified customers, the frozen saleswoman, the helpless security guard, they all saw it. A crack in the storm. "You think you're in control?" The gunman's voice was defensive now, not as sure of itself as before. He took a step back, his movements less erratic, more uncertain. He hadn't expected someone to challenge him so directly, hadn't accounted for someone refusing to crumble beneath the threat of violence. He had come in expecting fear, compliance, an easy way out. He hadn't expected resistance, least of all from someone who looked at him like he was already defeated. The man in front of him didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't show the slightest sign of intimidation. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice unwavering, steady. "You're not thinking clearly. You're scared, you're desperate, and you think this is the only way out. But it's not." A muscle in the gunman's jaw tensed. His hand shook, just slightly, just enough for those paying attention to notice. He was unraveling, the confidence that had carried him through the door slipping through his fingers like sand. His breathing grew heavier, his pulse visible in the way his throat moved. "Shut up." His words were less forceful now, lacking the conviction they had moments ago. The gun was still raised, but it wavered, dipping just slightly, enough to show that something was shifting inside him, something breaking. The people around them still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. The fear was still there, but something else had taken root, something unfamiliar, something none of them had expected. The saleswoman's heart pounded against her ribs, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her fingers ached. She had never seen anything like this, had never witnessed a situation like this unravel in a way that didn't follow the rules of fear and compliance. She had seen men beg for their lives, had seen people freeze, had seen chaos spiral out of control, but she had never seen someone look danger in the face and strip it of its power with nothing but words. The gunman's breath hitched. His gaze darted to the entrance, to the security guard, to the expensive glass cases lining the boutique. He was weighing his options, calculating his chances, realizing they were getting slimmer by the second. His grip tightened, then loosened, his fingers twitching like they couldn't decide whether to hold on or let go. The man took another step forward. Not fast, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance, just enough to make it clear that he wasn't afraid. "You don't want to hurt anyone," he said, softer now, his voice threading through the tension like a needle through fabric. "That's not who you are." The gunman's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He blinked, once, twice, his thoughts flickering across his face like static. And then, just for a moment, something in his expression cracked. A glimpse of something raw, something human. A glimpse of hesitation. And that was all he needed. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was enough to shift the air in the boutique. The weight of the gun sagged in the man's grip, his fingers twitching against the trigger guard as if his own body was betraying the anger that had driven him in here. His breathing was uneven now, no longer the controlled, forceful inhales of someone in command, but the erratic gulps of someone who had started to doubt himself. His eyes darted to the people around him, the silent customers frozen in place, the security guard who no longer seemed like a threat, and the woman behind the counter whose wide, unblinking stare reflected back at him like a mirror. His gaze snapped back to the man standing in front of him, the only one who hadn't shrunk in fear, the only one who had spoken to him like he wasn't a criminal but a man with a choice. The silence stretched. The gunman's hand wavered, but he didn't lower the weapon completely. His jaw tightened, his body rigid, trapped between instinct and uncertainty, between the urge to run and the crushing realization that there was nowhere left to go. His lips parted, but no words came out, as if whatever rage had pushed him into this moment was dissolving, slipping from his grasp like sand through his fingers. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. He was supposed to be in control. "Don't do this," the man in front of him said again, his voice still calm, still steady, but now carrying something heavier, something final. "You're not going to win. You already know that." The gunman's head shook, an almost imperceptible movement, but it was there. His grip tightened, then loosened again, his fingers twitching against the gun. His breathing had turned shallow, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven bursts. His mind was fighting itself, torn between the plan that had brought him here and the reality that was unfolding in front of him. It wasn't supposed to be like this. They were supposed to be afraid. They weren't supposed to question him, to talk to him like he was something other than a man holding a gun. His jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together as his gaze flickered between the exit and the man standing in front of him. There was a way out. There had to be. But every second that passed, every beat of silence that hung in the air, made it clearer that the window was closing. The longer he stood here, the less power he had. "Shut up," he muttered, but his voice lacked the force it had before. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a plea. The man took another step closer, slow, deliberate, his hands still open at his sides. His posture never changed. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation in the way he moved, just the same quiet certainty that had been unraveling the gunman from the moment he had spoken. "You don't want to do this," he said again, and this time, the words landed like a weight, pressing down on the gunman's already trembling hands. The woman behind the counter could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She hadn't moved since the moment the gun had been pointed at her, her body locked in place, every muscle tensed, every breath shallow and controlled. But now, for the first time, she saw something shift. The man in front of the gun wasn't backing down, and the gunman wasn't pushing forward. They were caught in a moment that could go in any direction, teetering on the edge of something irreversible. The tension stretched. The gunman's fingers flexed, his body locked in indecision, his mind trapped in a loop of conflicting impulses. His eyes darted to the exit again, then back to the man who had refused to break. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his Adam's apple jumping against the tight skin of his neck. His breathing turned ragged, shallow, uneven. Then, finally, something in him broke. His arm twitched, and the gun dipped. It was slight, just a fraction, just enough to signal hesitation, just enough to show that he had lost whatever resolve had carried him into this boutique. His shoulders sagged, his head tilted forward, and for the first time since stepping through the door, he looked smaller, less like a man in control and more like someone who had been fighting a losing battle from the start. The moment didn't last. The security guard moved, fast and precise, his training taking over the second the gun dipped below chest level. The shift was sudden, the sound of movement sharp against the suffocating silence, and before the gunman could react, his wrist was wrenched sideways, his fingers forced open by the sheer pressure of the guard's grip. The weapon clattered against the floor, the metallic clang echoing through the boutique like a gunshot. The gunman barely had time to process what had happened before he was shoved against the nearest glass display, his chest hitting the counter with a force that rattled the jewelry inside. His arms were yanked behind his back, his body locked in place by the security guard's iron grip. The fight was gone before it had even started. He didn't struggle. He didn't resist. He just stood there, chest heaving, eyes wide, face pale. The customers who had been frozen in fear finally exhaled. The woman behind the counter staggered back, her hands gripping the edge as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. The tension in the room didn't disappear, not completely, but it shifted, changed into something else, relief, disbelief, the kind of stunned silence that followed the unraveling of something that had come too close to disaster. The man who had stopped it all took a step back, his posture unchanged, his breathing even, as if the situation had played out exactly as he had known it would. He didn't say anything. He didn't react when the security guard forced the gunman to the ground, when the doors burst open and uniformed officers flooded in, when the voices of frightened customers turned into murmurs of shock and recognition. The woman behind the counter looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and for the first time since the moment he had walked through the door, she understood. It wasn't just confidence. It wasn't just presence. It was something else entirely. And as the whispers of the people around them grew louder, as realization settled into the faces of those who had watched everything unfold, she saw it in their eyes, the same thought repeating over and over again. They hadn't just witnessed a robbery. They had witnessed something no one in this boutique would ever forget. The store had not yet recovered from what had just happened. The air inside still felt thick, charged with everything that had unfolded in the last few minutes. The whispers had started, quiet at first, then growing as recognition spread through the room like an unspoken ripple. Customers exchanged glances, their eyes darting between the man who had stopped the robbery and the gunman now pressed against the floor, hands restrained, face blank with the kind of shock that came when reality set in too late. The security guard had regained his authority, pinning the assailant down with firm efficiency while speaking rapidly into his radio, relaying details to the arriving officers who were already pushing through the boutique doors. The sirens outside were still wailing, their distant echoes seeping into the store, but no one inside was looking at the police. All eyes remained fixed on the one person who had stepped forward when no one else had. The saleswoman had not moved from behind the counter. Her hands were still gripping the edge, her fingers pressing so tightly against the smooth surface that her knuckles had turned white. The adrenaline had not yet left her body, her heart still hammering, her breathing still uneven, her mind still trying to catch up with the fact that she was alive. She had not spoken since the moment she had first been threatened, had not dared to, but now, as the reality of what had just happened settled into the boutique, she forced herself to let go of the counter, her muscles stiff, reluctant. One of the customers exhaled sharply, breaking the tense silence that had fallen. Another let out something between a laugh and a breath of disbelief, shaking his head as if he couldn't quite process what he had just seen. The conversations began in hushed voices, growing louder with every second. They weren't talking about the robbery anymore. That was already becoming secondary. What they were discussing was him. "Did you see that?" One woman murmured, her voice barely above a whisper but loud enough to be heard by those closest to her. He talked the guy down. Just like that. Unbelievable. Who does that? Wait. Do you know who he is? The murmurs grew, overlapping, blending into each other as realization set in among the customers who had been too frozen in fear to register it before. Faces turned, eyes widened, whispers turned into low gasps of recognition. It wasn't just anyone who had stopped the robbery. It wasn't just some brave stranger who had stepped forward. It was him. The name finally slipped from someone's lips, too low at first, then repeated, louder, until it spread through the room like wildfire. The saleswoman heard it, but she didn't react. She was still staring, still watching, still trying to process how someone could walk into a situation like this and act as though they had known, without a single doubt, how it would end. She had seen confidence before. She had served men in expensive suits who carried themselves with arrogance, customers who thought money made them invincible, people who lived in their own world of status and power. But she had never seen this. He had not spoken like a man who knew his worth. He had spoken like a man who had nothing to prove. And that was what had changed everything. One of the officers moved toward him now, stepping over the shattered glass on the floor, his expression unreadable. "Sir, I need to ask you to step back," the officer said, his voice firm but laced with the same respect that had now filled the air between every person in the boutique. The man nodded, saying nothing, stepping back just enough to allow the officers to take over completely. There was no protest, no attempt to explain, no words needed. He didn't need recognition. He hadn't done it for that. The gunman, who had barely moved since being restrained, let out a shaky breath. His face was still tense, his body still locked in the rigid stiffness of someone who had just realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. His gaze flickered up toward the man who had stopped him, and for a brief moment, something unreadable passed through his eyes, something resembling understanding, or regret, or maybe just the crushing weight of defeat. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The saleswoman inhaled sharply, forcing air back into her lungs, forcing herself to break out of the frozen state that had held her captive since the moment the gun had been raised. Her eyes met his for the first time since it had ended, and for a second, she had the irrational urge to say something, anything, but no words seemed appropriate. A man had walked into this boutique just minutes ago, unnoticed, just another customer in a place that catered to wealth and status, a place where people only mattered based on what they could afford. But now, every person in this room was looking at him differently, not because of what he owned, but because of what he had done. And as the whispers continued, as the officers pulled the defeated gunman to his feet, as the tension in the boutique finally started to unravel, one thing became clear. No one would ever forget this moment. The boutique had not yet returned to normal. Even as the officers escorted the subdued gunman through the door, even as the security guard resumed his post near the entrance, even as customers shifted uneasily, adjusting their clothes, brushing off invisible dust, it was clear that normal no longer existed in this room. The tension had lifted, but something else remained, something unspoken, something that hung in the air between every person who had witnessed what had just happened. No one quite knew what to do. Some whispered among themselves, others stole glances at him, hesitant but unable to look away, as if they had been in the presence of something that did not belong in the predictable world they were used to. The saleswoman was still standing behind the counter, her fingers resting against the smooth surface as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her uniform still looked perfect, her posture still straight, but the look in her eyes had changed. She had spent years perfecting the art of being unnoticed, of existing just enough to serve, but never enough to be remembered. She had learned that customers did not look at her, not really. They saw her as part of the experience, an extension of the boutique itself, something necessary but unimportant. But now, she felt different. Not because of what had almost happened, but because of what she had seen unfold in front of her. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to move, to push past the weight of the moment. The shattered glass from the display case still glittered on the floor, and she instinctively reached for the small broom and dustpan kept beneath the counter. Her hands were steady now, though she wasn't sure how. The boutique needed to be restored, the world needed to keep turning, and the only way to regain control was to start with something small, something familiar, something she could manage. As she crouched down to sweep the shards into the pan, a shadow moved beside her. She glanced up and saw him standing there, the man who had changed everything, the man who had done what no one else in the room had even dared to attempt. He wasn't saying anything, wasn't looking for attention, wasn't expecting gratitude. He was simply watching her, a quiet presence in the aftermath of the chaos. She hesitated for only a second before speaking, her voice quieter than she expected. "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her, not with the polite indifference of a customer, not with the condescending amusement she had seen so many times before, but with something else, something more real. "Yeah," he said, his voice even, calm, as if he wasn't sure what else to say. She swept another pile of glass into the pan, her movements slow, deliberate. Most people would have just stood there, waited for the police. He exhaled, shifting his weight slightly. Most people don't think about what they do until it happens. She paused, looking up at him again. There was no arrogance in the way he said it, no need to justify himself, no expectation of praise. It was just a simple truth. He had done what he had done because, to him, there had been no other option. It wasn't about bravery. It wasn't about making a statement. It was just who he was. She studied him for a moment longer before standing, brushing off the front of her uniform. The boutique was still too quiet, the customers still lingering, pretending to browse but too distracted to focus. The murmurs had died down, but the weight of the moment hadn't left. The store manager had finally emerged from the back office, his expression a mixture of shock and frustration as he hurried toward the sales counter. His expensive watch glinted under the lights as he ran a hand through his neatly styled hair, his mind already shifting toward damage control. He glanced at the shattered display, at the customers still watching, at the security guard standing stiffly near the door, and then finally, at him. The realization hit immediately. The manager's eyes widened slightly before he masked his reaction with a well-practiced expression of professionalism. "Sir," he said, his tone carefully measured. I don't even know what to say. He hesitated, as if he couldn't quite find the right word. "That was incredible." The man didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the statement with anything more than a small nod. The manager's eyes flickered to the saleswoman, as if expecting her to say something, to contribute to the moment. She held his gaze for a second before turning away, focusing on sweeping up the last pieces of broken glass. She had no interest in playing a role in whatever this moment was supposed to be. The manager cleared his throat, shifting his attention back to the man in front of him. "Please, allow me to offer you something as a gesture of gratitude," he continued, his voice taking on the smooth, practiced tone of someone who had spent years mastering the art of customer relations. "A private shopping experience, a personal consultation, anything you'd like. The boutique would be honored." The customers, still lingering, still listening, seemed to lean in slightly, waiting for his response. But he didn't hesitate, didn't even need to consider it. "No, thank you," he said simply. The manager blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, well, at the very least, perhaps a small gifty. I don't need anything." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. The manager faltered, then nodded, stepping back slightly as if unsure what to do next. The customers exchanged glances, clearly intrigued, clearly expecting something more. But there was nothing more. The man turned slightly, glancing once more at the saleswoman before making his way toward the door. The security guard stepped aside instinctively, as if unsure whether to thank him or let him leave without a word. The boutique was still watching, still holding on to the moment, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. As he reached the door, one of the customers, a woman dressed in elegant designer clothing, whispered something to her companion. The words were quiet, barely audible, but the saleswoman heard them anyway. "I thought people like him didn't exist." The saleswoman didn't look up, didn't react, didn't let the words settle too deeply. She had seen what had happened. She didn't need someone else's interpretation of it. The door opened, the bell chimed softly, and then he was gone. For a few seconds, no one moved. The boutique felt different now, as if something had shifted, something unspoken, something no one knew how to name. The customers, slowly, began to return to their shopping, their voices hesitant at first, then growing louder, trying to fill the space he had left behind. The manager exhaled, rubbing his temple before walking away, already preparing an explanation for corporate. The saleswoman swept the last few shards of glass into the dustpan before straightening up, brushing her hands together. The boutique would return to normal soon. The jewelry would be rearranged, the display cases repaired, the customers would leave and new ones would arrive. But she knew something had changed. Not just for her, not just for the people who had been here, but for everyone who had seen the difference between standing still and stepping forward. She didn't know his name. She didn't need to. She would remember him anyway.